My father passed away before the sun had fully risen, on a cold and silent winter morning. He was in a hospice bed set up in the middle of the living room, covered by a blanket I had chosen for him last winter. I sat beside him, not crying. I didn't offer any last words. Everything had already been prepared. I stood up and retrieved a file from a kitchen cabinet. Inside were the necessary documents arranged weeks ago. I placed them on the table, opened the draft of the obituary, and read it one more time from beginning to end. There was no mention of my mother. Not a single word, not even a comma was dedicated to her. Today, I write the obituary. There is no grieving wife here. Where are you tuning in from? Have you ever had to stay silent to keep the peace, or chosen to speak up and accept the consequences? Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe to hear true stories, where the truth isn't always easy to hear. My name is Nora Whitman. I am 34 years old, a freelance accountant living in Columbus, Ohio. I have no siblings. I've lived alone since I was 24, and I cared for my father during the final stage of his life in this very home, a 2-bedroom apartment on the north side of the city. My mother is still alive, but we have no regular communication. It's not for a lack of trying, but because every attempt at reconciliation has been either rejected or deflected. My father, Charles Whitman, lived with chronic lung disease for 15 years and had suffered a stroke that left him unable to walk. He retired early, spending most of his subsequent years with my mother in the eastern suburbs. I still visited, but only by appointment. After his stroke in 2015, my mother took complete control of their finances, including bank accounts, insurance cards, and all care-related decisions. Everything changed in 2020 when I was granted medical and financial power of attorney after an incident where he was hospitalized and my mother refused to consent to his treatment. This past August, I brought my father to live with me. Hospice care was implemented within the first week. I rearranged the living room, rented a hospital bed, and set up the necessary equipment following the nurse's instructions. My mother didn't object. She only sent a text saying, "If that's what he chooses, I won't stop him." From that moment on, I began to document everything. Medication times, equipment delivery dates, doctor's appointments, and emails with hospice staff. I wasn't doing it because I suspected anyone, but because I knew that one day I would need to cross-reference the facts. And that day came sooner than I expected. Nurse Olivia arrived close to 9 in the morning, less than 2 hours after my father had passed. She brought the death confirmation form, a list for medication disposal, and a bag of paperwork. There were no superfluous questions, no lengthy condolences. I showed her the marked medication boxes, the POA file, and the confirmation letter from the hospice doctor. "I'll record the time of death as you reported it." "He went peacefully," Olivia said, signing the confirmation box. I nodded and opened my notebook, adding a new entry. 12/1, 9:14 a.m., death confirmed, Olivia R. Beside me, the documents were stacked in 4 small piles, each marked with a colored sticky note. Power of attorney, cremation, medication, internal communications. The back bedroom remained silent. My mother was sleeping in there, the door unopened since last night. I didn't call for her. I knew she was aware of what had happened, but she wouldn't want to do anything right now, and I didn't need any further confirmation from her. Around noon, Pastor Michael from St. Luke's Church called. His voice was calm, accustomed to calls like this. "If the family wishes to hold a memorial service, I'm available to coordinate. A formal ceremony isn't required. I just need to know your needs." I thanked him, then stated clearly, my father didn't want a casket, no eulogy, and no one to interpret his life for him. Just a simple memorial. Anyone who needed to say something could. Before ending the call, he asked one more question. "Will the family be preparing an obituary?" I replied, "I will write it, and I will only write what can be verified." In the afternoon, I received a call from Maple & Sons Funeral Home. The caller, Paul Hines, the director, explained the cremation process in the state of Ohio. According to regulations, The cremation authorization form required the signature of either the spouse or the person holding official medical power of attorney. I confirmed that I held a valid medical POA, had already submitted a copy last week, and was ready to provide it again if needed. However, Mr. Hines explained that some cases still required spousal confirmation before proceeding, especially if no conflict was noted in the record. I understood his meaning. If my mother didn't consent, the cremation would be delayed. I emailed him the POA again, along with the date of signing and the name of the confirming physician. Then I called my mother. She answered after a few rings. Her voice was hoarse and curt, asking nothing more than a single question. Why the rush? I explained that my father had clearly stated his wish for a simple cremation without ceremony, and that delaying things would only complicate matters. She was silent for a moment before saying she wasn't ready to sign anything. I didn't argue. I simply stated that if she wanted to keep the survivor benefits from Social Security, I would not interfere. I also reminded her that the decision to retain those benefits came with legal responsibilities, which included signing the final arrangements. That evening, I received an email from my mother containing a scanned file of her signature on the cremation form. There was no accompanying message. I printed it and submitted it to Maple & Sons the very next morning. I started a new spreadsheet, naming it Post-Death Comms. The first row logged the date, time, recipient, and attached files for each step. I wanted to ensure every future communication had a specific timestamp, an explicit confirmation, and could not be distorted. That night, Pastor Michael called again to check on the progress of the arrangements. I told him all the procedures were being handled, but that I couldn't be certain the family would agree on the details of the service. He gently reminded me that in times like these, restraint was the most important thing to maintain. I agreed with him but made no promises. Instead, I made it clear that from now on, all communication regarding the arrangements should be in writing. That way, no one could misremember or reinterpret another person's words in a way that suited them. It took me nearly half a day to finalize the obituary. The essential information had already been verified: full name, birth year, residence, date of death, and underlying cause of illness. I double-checked his retirement records to ensure the work milestones were correct. My father had started his career as a railroad engineer at 22, retired after almost 40 years, and never changed professions. I listed the places he had lived, the hospitals where he received treatment, and the church where the memorial would be held. There were no personal details beyond the timeline. There was no survived by his loving wife. My mother's name was not there. The closing sentence was simple. A private memorial service will be held at St. Luke's Church this weekend. The family requests no flowers or donations. I printed a copy for Pastor Michael to review before I sent it officially. He read it from top to bottom, maintaining a neutral expression. When he folded the paper, he asked only one question. "Are you sure you want to leave the family section completely blank?" I nodded. If I wrote anything else, people would think everything had been fine, but it wasn't. He gave a slight nod, not arguing. He only mentioned that changes could still be made before the official posting. I thanked him and left his office. That afternoon, I sent the obituary to Maple & Sons. The director, Paul Hines, confirmed that the text violated no standards. He said there was no legal requirement to list a spouse if the writer chose not to. They would post it on their official website the next morning and forward it to the church. I thought that was the end of it. But that evening, my mother sent a text message. There was no inquiry about how I was, no mention of my father. Just one short line. "The obituary is incomplete. Perhaps you did that on purpose." I put the phone down without replying. I had nothing to say. This hadn't started today, and it couldn't be resolved through another conversation. I made a note in my journal and underlined it. The response came sooner than I expected. I wasn't sure how she had seen the draft. Maybe Maple & Sons sent a confirmation to both of us, or perhaps the church had forwarded it as an administrative habit. I didn't investigate further. It wouldn't change anything. Before going to sleep, I opened the obituary and read it from beginning to end one more time. Every sentence was true. Every date had evidence to back it up. Nothing needed to be added, and nothing should be removed. I closed the file, turned off my desk lamp, and wrote one last line in my notebook. Not for anyone else to read, but for myself to look back on when needed. They don't need to know how he lived. They just want to see their own name in the story. I began to gather everything that could prove each step of my father's care during his final 3 months. Printouts of hospice appointments, the morphine prescription from early November, and timesheets from the visiting nurses. I arranged them chronologically, clipping each set into its own folder. I also printed the joint bank account statements for my father and mother from June through November. Among the many recurring transactions, there was one unexplained transfer out, made the exact week he was hospitalized. I made no additional notes, just underlined it in black ink. Next to it was an old email my mother had sent, suggesting we delay buying morphine because he doesn't need a high dose yet. I scheduled a meeting with Addie. Rachel is at her office, 3 blocks from my home on Wednesday afternoon. She read the file without a word for the first 10 minutes, only asking a question when she found an overlapping or missing date. "What is the purpose of archiving these documents?" she asked, her eyes still on the medication log. "I don't intend to publish anything, but if I am questioned, I will not respond with emotion." Rachel nodded. "Then you need to distinguish between 3 types of information. 1. Events with evidence. 2. Subjective assessments. And 3. Conclusions about another person's motives. You should only stick to the first." "I have no need to label anyone," I said. "I just want that if someone asks, I'll have an answer ready with dates and facts." Rachel carefully checked each item, then folded a copy for her records. "If you maintain this approach, the likelihood of a defamation suit is almost 0. But if you say something that could be interpreted as a conclusion about behavior, for example, she was profiting, then a risk arises." I nodded, writing down her exact words. Not to protect myself, but to avoid any missteps later. That evening, I explained the plan to Ethan. He listened silently, and then suggested, "You should make a timeline. From the day your father moved in until the day he passed, with dates, times, a description, and the corresponding document. If anyone asks anything, just point to the column," I agreed. I hadn't thought of it before, but this method would save me from repeating the same explanation over and over. It would also prevent me from misspeaking out of exhaustion. The next morning, Pastor Michael called again. He had heard there was tension after the obituary was sent out. He didn't criticize or try to intervene, only said gently, "A time of grieving can make people say things they shouldn't. If you can maintain your composure, you are already halfway there." I replied that I had no intention of arguing publicly, but I also had no intention of letting the truth be erased, simply because someone else found it inconvenient. He paused for a few seconds before ending the call. "I understand. I only hope you remember. The truth can still be told in a way that allows people to hear it, rather than resist it." I said thank you, then returned to the file I was working on. Not a single word within it would be omitted. Not because I wanted to be right, but because I refused to leave another blank space. On Friday morning, the official obituary was posted on the Maple & Sons website. Ethan checked the content, and formatting one last time to ensure there were no typos or layout errors. On the St. Luke's Church site, the announcement section was also updated on schedule. I did nothing more. I didn't share the link, didn't inform relatives, didn't make a comment. People would see it eventually, and those who needed to react certainly would. The phone started ringing around noon. There weren't many calls, but most were from distant relatives or old friends of my father. Some opened with simple questions like, "I see Diane's name is missing. Is that a typo? Or did the family decide not to include her name for a personal reason?" I gave only one answer, the same one every time. The obituary was written by me and approved according to the standards of Maple & Sons. There are no content errors. Then I would say a polite goodbye and end the call. I offered no further comment, no other explanation. By afternoon, my mother, Diane, had posted a long entry on her personal Facebook page. She didn't mention me by name, but used phrases like the child who appointed herself the right to rewrite memories and selecting truths to serve a distorted perspective. The post was quickly shared by a few people in the church community, accompanied by comments that subtly implied an attitude of ingratitude and coldness. I wasn't surprised. Her choice to communicate via social media instead of a direct conversation had happened many times before. I noted the time the post was published, copied the main content into my logbook, and set it aside. I didn't reply. I didn't read the comments either. Pastor Michael made no public comment on the post, but at the end of the day, he sent a group email to the church's bereavement committee. In it, he reminded them that the memorial service should focus on the deceased and not become a venue for expanding disputes. He also suggested that all online statements should maintain respect among members of the community. Ethan asked if I planned to write anything to clarify the situation. I said no. Any words I add now will be seen as a reaction. And if I react, it means I've let emotion take the lead. That evening, I reopened the timeline I had created. Each column was clear. Date of communication, main content, recipient, and whether there was an attachment. I added a new line under the entry for December 5th. Diane reacted publicly. No request for correction, no direct contact. I realized I didn't need to do anything else. Her reaction was beyond my control. But my own reaction was something I could choose to keep silent. Before bed, I looked at the obituary one last time. My father's name stood formally at the top, and below it were the facts of what he had done, how he had lived, and what he had chosen. No one was insulted. No one was labeled. The only person left out was the one who had left me with nothing I could write without embracing a lie. On Sunday morning, the auxiliary hall of St. Luke's Church was opened early for the memorial. There were no funeral wreaths, no large portrait, no white tablecloths. On the podium was a simple photo frame next to a small wooden box containing the ashes. Pastor Michael chose a short piano piece to begin. No one was scheduled for formal speeches. He spoke only a few words before yielding the floor. This is not a funeral. It is not a time to reinterpret the life of Mr. Charles Whitman. We are here because he was a clear presence in each of our lives. If you feel there is something you need to share, please come forward. An old friend of my father's spoke first. He recounted working with him at the railroad for over 10 years, mentioning their regular lunches, their arguments about baseball, and a business trip where neither could sleep in the unfamiliar beds. He concluded briefly, "Charles wasn't easy to get to know at first, but once you understood him, you'd never leave his side." After him came a nurse who had cared for my father before he entered hospice. She spoke of his cooperation during every bandage change, and the way he expressed thanks with his eyes when his voice was no longer clear. No one mentioned my mother, not a single word. Midway through the service, Uncle Robert stood up. He didn't look at anyone, just strolled to the podium and held the microphone with both hands. Charles was my brother-in-law. We weren't close, but there are some things I need to say, not to criticize, but to set straight what has been glossed over. He paused, then looked directly at the seats below. During the 3 weeks Charles was in the hospital last year, I happened to see a printed bank statement on their kitchen table. There were 3 transfers out, on the very day he lost consciousness. I didn't understand, so I asked, but no one answered. A chair scraped loudly from behind. Diane stood up. "Are you implying I stole money from my husband?" Her voice was louder than the microphone. "What right do you have to come up here and spread lies?" Robert didn't respond. He simply placed the microphone back on the table and returned to his seat. Ethan stood up, stepped into the aisle, and held a piece of paper. He didn't approach the podium but simply spoke loudly enough to be heard. On April 17th, 3 withdrawals were made from the joint account, the same day Charles was admitted to the hospital. An email sent from Diane's address to the bank reads, "I need to separate my portion before his condition worsens. All of this has been saved and authenticated." Diane turned and walked quickly toward the exit. She said nothing more. No one followed her. Pastor Michael returned to the podium, noting that the time for sharing was over. He thanked everyone, inviting those who wished to stay to do so, and others to leave quietly. Some people stood up. The rest remained silent. I sat still through the entire service, not speaking, not nodding or shaking my head. I just looked at the podium, where my father's small photo frame sat next to the wooden box, and I knew he would not have wanted anyone to speak for him about things he had not chosen to record. That night, I couldn't sleep. The house was quiet again, but it wasn't the silence of the hospice nights. There was no heavy breathing, no dim light for monitoring medication, but I could feel a different kind of sound. The invisible noise that arises when you start to ask yourself, did I go too far? I made a cup of hot tea and sat in the chair by the window. On the table was the file I hadn't put away, the timeline still open, and a note Ethan had left. No one speaks the truth for you. You didn't run from it. I thought back to the scene in the hall. Uncle Robert's voice hadn't trembled, but I knew it must have taken a great deal of struggle for him to step up to that podium. Diane didn't let anyone finish speaking. Ethan just read the facts, without adding a single word of his own. I had said nothing, but I was the one who wrote the obituary that led to it all. I wondered if I had derailed the memorial from its original purpose. I hadn't expected absolute reverence, but I hadn't thought things would become so confrontational. No one could have predicted it all, but people would still look to me first. A text from Nurse Olivia arrived near midnight. It wasn't long, just a single paragraph. I want you to know you did everything right. Mr. Charles received the right medication, at the right time, from the right people. We in hospice don't easily grow fond of patients' families, but you were different. If you need anything confirmed, just let me know. I read the message 3 times. Then I put the phone down without replying immediately. A mixed feeling settled in me. Not relief, not anger. Just something akin to, finally, someone has confirmed that what I did was not just procedurally correct. Pastor Michael called the next morning. His voice was deeper than usual. I did not expect the memorial to have such a tense moment, but I also understand that sometimes the truth needs to be spoken, even when it is not gentle. I asked him if he thought I should apologize for what happened. He was silent for a few seconds, then said, "No one apologizes for choosing accuracy, but no one loses anything by choosing a way of speaking that allows others to listen." I wrote that sentence down in my notebook. Below the previous day's entry, I added, "Not everyone wants the truth, but if they ask, they deserve to hear all of it." Ethan cleared my desk for me before he went to bed. He didn't say anything, just picked up the old teacup, gathered the loose papers, and placed my notebook in its proper place. I stood beside him watching for a few seconds, then said, "I'm not sure if I should have written the obituary differently." He didn't turn around, just answered succinctly, "If you had, it wouldn't have been you." I didn't argue, not because I had nothing to say, but because his words said enough. That night, I put the notebook in the desk drawer and closed it. For the first time in weeks, I turned off the lights without leaving any glow in the room, not because I was at peace, but because I needed one night without being forced to remember it all again. The meeting took place at a Tinger Rachel's office on Wednesday morning, 5 days after the memorial. I arrived 10 minutes early, carrying printouts of the entire file I had prepared. Diane came after me, accompanied by an old friend who used to be the church treasurer. Rachel invited all 3 of us into the room, poured water, and began with a simple statement. "We will keep this meeting brief and focused." On the table were 3 identical printouts, each containing 3 main sections: probate procedures, communication boundaries, and the principles of disclosing personal information after a death. Rachel distributed a copy to each of us, requesting we read it before the discussion began. "I want to confirm that there are no disputes regarding assets," Rachel said. "Nora's father left a small personal account and some insurance. There was no formal will, so it will be handled according to standard distribution rules. Diane has already received survivor benefits as per federal regulations, with no contest from Nora. Diane did not object. She only asked quietly, "What documents will I be able to keep after today's session?" Rachel answered clearly, "You will receive copies of all probate-related documents, along with a confirmation of file closure upon completion. Each copy will be signed to acknowledge receipt." The second part dealt with communication boundaries. Rachel proposed that all future exchanges be conducted via email, with no personal calls or texts, to avoid misunderstandings. I agreed immediately. Diane hesitated slightly, then nodded after rereading the final sentence. "All correspondence requires a response within 3 business days." When it came to the final, most contentious section, Rachel read each line as if to emphasize that this was non-negotiable. The published obituary does not violate any legal or ethical regulations. There is no provision in the law that compels the inclusion of family members, including a spouse, in a public announcement. Nora's decision not to include Diane's name does not constitute misconduct or cause for damages. Diane pushed her copy of the papers forward slightly. "I'm not asking for money. I just want a one-line correction, so that people don't think I was erased from his life." Rachel's expression remained unchanged. "The issue is that the absence of a name does not equate to an accusation, and any change after publication requires the consent of the original author." I looked directly at Diane. "That text is the truth. If I had to write a name, I would also have to write everything associated with it, and I was not going to do that." Diane said nothing more. She looked out the window for a moment, then nodded. None of the nods in that meeting were of relief. They were simply acknowledgments that things had reached their limit. The 3 of us signed each copy of the agreement. Rachel closed the file, printed a final confirmation, and handed one to each of us. I organized my papers, placed them in a hardcover folder, and stood up with a brief farewell. On the way home, I didn't check my phone. I knew there would be no message that could change what had just been signed. The only thing left was to adhere to the commitments we had just made. Nothing more, nothing less. On Saturday afternoon, I brought my father's ashes to Alum Creek Park. It was about a 30-minute drive from my house, with a small path leading down to the water's edge, a place few people visited in the cold season. I didn't notify anyone. I didn't post about it online, send invitations, or ask for opinions. This was not part of the agreement. I set the wooden box on a stone ledge, slowly removed the lid, and quietly let the ashes drift away with each gentle gust of wind. The lake was calm, with no sound other than the dry rustle of leaves. I didn't pray or speak aloud. I just stood there, holding the urn until it was empty. I had brought a folded piece of paper with me, on which I had written a few short lines. There were no names, no titles, no descriptions of the past or of suffering. Just a single thought. He worked for nearly 40 years and never missed a shift. He lived in silence and never asked for pity. And he departed as he had lived, without waiting for anyone to speak on his behalf. After reading it, I folded the paper, lit it with a lighter, and let its ashes join the rest. The wind wasn't strong, so the charred fragments swirled a few times before settling on the grass. There was no special effect. I wasn't waiting for one. On the way back, I stopped by St. Luke's to leave an envelope. Inside was an application to establish a small scholarship fund in my father's name. Each year, the amount would be enough for one engineering student to buy textbooks. I didn't use my own name. The sender was listed only as established in memory of a profession. Pastor Michael wasn't there. I just left the paperwork at the reception desk and returned to my car. I didn't need a confirmation, nor did I request a notification. What needed to be done was done. That evening, I sat alone in the living room and opened my laptop to write one final email to Diane. The content was brief, following the template Rachel had suggested. Hello? The scattering of the ashes was completed on January 14th at Alum Creek Park, in accordance with the wish for no ceremony. Any further communication, if necessary, should be sent to this email address. Calls and text messages will not be received. I hit send. No attachments, no closing, no opening any other tabs. Then I went into my email settings and created a filter. If a message arrived from her address, the system would automatically label it family contact and mark it as read. Not deleted, not auto-replied, just left as is. When the clock struck 9, I took out my notebook one last time. I wrote the final entry in blue ink, with the same handwriting I had used for the past 3 months. Not everyone needs to bear witness. It is enough to know it was done, correctly and completely. I closed the notebook and placed it in the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet, where no one would touch it without permission. It didn't need a lock, it just needed to be left in peace. My mother did not reappear at the church. No one mentioned her in the conversations I overheard. Ethan said that Uncle Robert had taken a short leave of absence, likely due to pressure from relatives. I didn't ask for more details. I returned to my old work schedule, cleared the corner of the room where the hospice bed had been, and replaced the section of flooring worn down by the wheelchair. I didn't remove the notes taped to the medicine cabinet. The writing had faded, but I left them there. Not out of sentimentality, but because they were the part I wanted to keep. To remember that I had done enough, one step at a time. At the end of the month, I received an automated email from the funeral home's system. The obituary for Charles E. Whitman is about to expire fro.